Thank you, Itamar. And in this session, there are two speakers. The first is Dr. Sylwia Karolak. She is the Deputy Director of the Institute of Polish Philology in Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan. She is the author of the monograph, The Experience of the Holocaust in Polish Literature, 1947-1991, the canon that didn't come into being, and disputes about the stones of the rampart of Alexander Kamiński. She is co-editor of the collective work Traces of World War II and the Holocaust in the Latest Polish Literature, and others. And today, Sylwia will talk about Polish reception of Batsheva Dagan's books for children. Sylwia?
Thank you, Roman. Thank you very much. My presentation is really short, and I hope I will make it all in time. So I share it. Okay. Is it good or no?
Yes, it's okay.
Thanks. Okay, so the Polish reception of Batsheva Dagan's books for children. A study of a Polish reception of books by Israeli writer Batsheva Dagan is a good opportunity to make an introductory look at what Holocaust-related books for children and young adults published in other countries have been translated and published in Poland. These include Spanish Fume by Anton Fortes, the Polish title is Dym, and the Italian Bruno, The Boy Who Learned to Fly. It's a book about Bruno Schulz. Furthermore, published in the USA, Otto, the autobiography of a teddy bear by Tommy Ungerer, and My Dog Lala by Roman Kent. Apart from the aforementioned books, the following books by Israeli writer Uri Orlev have been published in Poland: The Island on Burr Street and Run Boy Run, and also a short story, Grandmada's Knitting, intended for younger readers. In turn, 3 books for children and young people by Batsheva Dagan, born like Orlev in Poland from where she emigrated to Israel after the war. So the 3 books by Batsheva Dagan were published in Poland in 2012. First, What Happened in the Shoah, a story in rhyme for children who wish to know. Chica the Dog in the Ghetto. And finally, If the Stars Could Only Speak. The Polish biographical references also include Today a Siren Cried for Me, which, however, as my research indicated, has not been translated into Polish, but is certainly available in English. In addition, a collection of poems from her it's titled Imagination, Blessed Be Cursed Be, Reminiscences from There, addressed to an adult audience. I would like to dwell on this publication for a moment before turning to a consideration of Dagan books for children, which are the ones that most concern me here. The shock of reception of Imagination, Blessed Be Cursed Be, born at the intersection of the quiet, unpoetic, almost prose-like narrative and the content, the images it brings. Dagan writes about difficult subjects perceived as shameful, which only sporadically appear in the Polish relations of women survivors. About the infertility of female prisoners subjected to experiments, about difficult relations between prisoners, about struggles with carnality, about nudity exposed to the stares of German soldiers, about the public use of latrines, about defecating in the snow, about bodily secretions, also about menstruations, about humiliations that touches the farthest depths of the being. At the same time, and this is certainly what distinguishes this lyrical account, the writer presents the extreme experiences primarily as her own. She does not hide behind someone else's fate. One points to the multitude of books for children and young people about the Holocaust published in Poland in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. This overrepresentation is not accompanied by numerous translations from other languages. Why? I see here a mechanism similar to that which at one time influenced the canon of readings or the corpus of text on the Holocaust for adults. Certainly, it was the conviction that so many important publications had appeared in Poland that it stopped the reception of foreign publications. Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska wrote, comparing the Polish and American canon, that, quote, authors known in America, such as Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Jean Amery, Charlotte Delbo, and even Anne Frank, exist minimally in the consciousness of Polish audience, end of quote. Another thing is that the Holocaust as a topic had to wait until the second half of the 1980s to enter Polish culture and literature on a permanent basis. Moreover, Haben sua fatali belli books have their fates. World reception usually follows domestic reception, and thus, for a book to have an international career, is need to be recognized in the place of publication. In this context, I'm very curious, and this question is addressed to you, dear colleagues, if Batsheva Dagan is the most recognizable writer in Israel, and if her books were most successful than the books of other authors. In other words, was popularity in Israel the reason why her publications were chosen by Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum and translated and published in Poland? Okay, so this is those books I'm talking about. Okay. Some Polish books for children and young people about the Holocaust have been translated into foreign languages. What are the Polish-Israeli contacts and exchanges of ideas within the field of translating and publishing books for children and young people? The Blumka's Diary by Iwona Chmielewska has been translated into Hebrew. Only books by Batsheva Dagan and Uri Orlev, as I know, has been translated from Hebrew into Polish. I think that this name, Batsheva Dagan, doesn't mean much to most people in Poland. Perhaps slightly more people in Poland recognize the writer thanks to her speech, which took place during the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the liberation of the German camp Auschwitz-Birkenau. The ceremony was widely commented in Poland, also due to Marian Turski's speech, who said that quote, Auschwitz did not fall from the sky, end of quote. It was during this ceremony that, in addition to the Marian Turski, other former Auschwitz-Birkenau prisoners spoke, Elza Becker, Stanisław Zalewski, and Batsheva Dagan. The author of What Happened in the Shoah is a Holocaust survivor. During the war, she was in the Radom ghetto, did forced labor in Germany, and was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau for 2 years, from where she reached the Ravensbrück and Malchow camps on a death march in early 1945. She lived to see the liberation by the American army on 2nd of May 1945. What is also important in the context of this consideration, Batsheva Dagan is an educator, pedagogue, psychologist, and the creator of, this is the quote, a pedagogical, psychological method that helps to teach children and youth about the Shoah, end of quote. On the website of Yad Vashem Institute, one can read, quote, Batsheva is a pioneer in the field of Holocaust teaching for young children. Batsheva also tells her life story to Israel Defense Forces, soldiers, and schools in Israel and abroad, end of quote. Dagan visits schools all over the world, including Polish ones, talks to children and tells them about the reality of the Holocaust. As she says, quote, "There are people who believe that children should not be informed about the Holocaust, but is life just dancing and singing? Children go through different dramas too. It is necessary to tell them about sad things. This is preparation for life. It is only necessary to speak about them skillfully. The whole world forgets that we now live in the media world. Children know more than we think. That is why when I meet children, I always ask, what do you know? And the next question is, what do you want to know? I have to see what I can afford to say next. And the age of the children is also important. We adults often underestimate their perception and wisdom. Sometimes I ask whether we should teach about the Holocaust, whether it is good that we teach about it. And I often hear these answers. Yes, because it is our history. It should be remembered. It should be a warning. When I write for children, there must always be at least a little happy ending. I do not want to hurt their faith in humanity, end of quote. The previously mentioned books by Dagan are generally not available in bookstores in Poland. The exceptions in this regard are the bookstores of the publishers, the bookstore of Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum, where you can buy the poetry volume Imagination Blessed Bickersby and Chica the Dog in the Ghetto, as well as the website of the Podlasie Opera and Philharmonic European Art Center in Białystok, where the book What Happened in the Shoah was published. It is therefore difficult to talk about distribution of these books. Libraries also have only single copies of some titles at their disposal. Reaching these publications required some effort. I mention this to show that this situation may affect the Polish reception of Dagan's books. As I said in the introduction, What Happened in the Shoah was published in 1991 in Hebrew and in Poland in 2012. The perspective of a Jewish witness, the one who speaks out to preserve the posterity, the truth about wartime events, is very clearly outlined here. Dagan emphasizes the uniqueness of the situation of the Jews, whose fate was different from that of other nations, according to the author, which must come as a surprise, including the Roma. So, quote, Polish, Russians, Gypsies, Hitler hated without shame, but more than all, he hated the Jews, end of quote. Dagan writes about the ghettos, the train journey to the camps, the fate of Jewish families, death, but also the Jewish struggle and decision to settle in Israel after the war. Despite the introduction to the story of Peretz, a fighter who chooses Israel and is described as David's grandfather, my grandson's grandfather, the recognitions are nevertheless general. This is a story about war and the Holocaust, observed, however, from a father perspective. The whole story is in rhyme, as the title indicates, which certainly makes it more accessible, thus influencing its reception, and I believe weakening the impact of the images and verbal message by softening the overtones of individual words and statements. Monika Wójcik-Dudek wrote about this book, quote, the rhymed story with eye-catching illustrations by Ola Cieślak reads like the credo of the author who has resolved to engage in dialogue about the Holocaust with a child, end of quote. Krzysztof Rybak was less general about the book, saying that its consciousness makes the accents in the story unevenly distributed. Quote, the glorious deeds of partisans and Jews fighting with Germans occupied quite a lot of space in this book, although these were marginal cases. So, however, does not change the fact that a well-known educator in Israel, Batsheva Dagan, who teaches about the Holocaust, also noticed and describes cases of courageous armed actions of the Jewish community, end of quote. The reception of what happened in the Shoah is therefore negligible. What Happened in the Shoah heralds the second publication of Dagan, Chica, a dog from Ghetto Dog from 1992, first published in Poland in 2012 and for the second time relatively recently in 2018. Already in the rhyming story I discussed above, the author informs us, quote, Hitler from the Jews, he ordered that their silver and gold and all other costly objects be taken. He even ordered in his ghastly anger to take their dogs from them, for he had not a shred of mercy, end of quote. And this statement finds its plot development in the subsequent publication. The book, Chica, the Dog of the Ghetto, has received quite an extensive reception, which certainly has to do with the presence of animal protagonists. Piotr Kurpiński, among others, wrote most extensively about Chica, pointing to the clearly educational profile of the book, which was conceived as a proposal for early childhood education, such as, for example, quote, information about the gradual exclusion by the Nazis of the Jewish population or people of Jewish descent from the human family, or the recognition that according to the Nazis, the recent animal companions of Jewish families ranked higher than them in the Darwinian hierarchy, and precisely for this reason, they should be protected from dishonorable contact with beings considered bovine subhumans, end of quote. This historical context leads Krupiński to call Chica anti-fairy tale. This content, which the author omits, should not be, quote, applied to children at bedtime. Instead, the merciful narrator offers an argument. The Germans want to deprive their victims of their last chance to defend themselves. That does not exceed the threshold of the young reader's perspective abilities, and at the same time initiates them the unambiguously sinister intentions of the aggressors, end of quote. Anita Jarzyna assesses this procedure differently. Quote, in this short story addressed to the youngest children at the center of the experience and trauma of the main human protagonist, 5-year-old Michaś, is the ban of owning dogs imposed by the Germans. The researchers cited above, so Anita Jarzyna, is critical of the entire Dagan's book. Quote, it must be emphasized that the booklet published several years ago by the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum differs significantly in the level of its message, including its dual illustrations from other related publications. Dagan's story is the only one that fully confirms the concerns that have been raised about the subject in children's literature. Chica, A Dog in the Ghetto, is reminiscent of a biased reading book. Its characters' experiences are far too simplified, and it is unlikely to convince a contemporary audience, end of quote. Alexandra Sikora makes similar critical remarks, quote, despite the fact that the author directs the text to preschoolers, the degree on infantilization seems too high. The order to bring all dogs to the square near the police by 3 o'clock, as it seems an equivalent of the gathering of Jews at the Umschlagplatz in the Warsaw Ghetto, is not convincing, and the war, which can be slept through in a hole under the floor, does not seem to be anything terrible. Obviously, according to the assumptions, the difficult subject matter is not supposed to make the viewer panic, but it should not distort the facts either, end of quote. The researcher negatively assesses the way that the characters are constructed, the narration and the language of Dagan's stories. As she writes, quote, Michaś remains a great unknown. The author fails to convey the character of a child, and the characters she creates are paper, which makes their fates indifferent to the viewer. According to Sikora, Dagan does not try, as other authors do, especially if they are much older, to create a platform of understanding with the young viewer. The introduction of third-person narration and the perspective of speaking from the here and now, is also counterproductive. and the quote. In Dagan's text, there are also glossaries at the end of the stories, but these are far less well-told stories, and the fact that they are translations does not justify this. Both translators, Dagan and Raczyńska, use mostly simple or perhaps double-entendre sentence. The monotonous flow of narration is rarely interrupted by dialogues, the expressions of which hardly differs from the descriptive parts. End of quote. Agnieszka Makowiecka-Pastusiak, in turn, like Aleksandra Sikola, analyzes Chica and other publications by Dagan, If the Stars Could Only Speak. As she points out in the former book, Dagan abandoned a literal description of the reality of the ghetto in favor of an empathetic account of fear, loss, and longing. While in the latter, more difficult book, she does not avoid showing the brutality against Jews. Both stories are supposed to be dominated by psychological suffering. The researcher points out, however, that in both books, it is clear who the perpetrator is. Nevertheless, Dagan does not introduce death into them. In Chica, she is not present at all, and in the latter book, she is not called by name either. Unexpectedly, one day, her husband was taken away. No one knows where. No one saw him again after that. These are sentences from the first page of the book. By the end, when all the characters have survived, no one remembers anymore. So the basic truth of the Holocaust remains unspoken. End of quote. I refer here to the words of Dagan herself, cited at the beginning, explaining the reasons of these decisions. In a previous seminar in Lublin, we spoke more extensively on this subject, pointing out the causes, but also the consequences of this situation. If the Stars Could Only Speak is classified as a publication for fourth grade pupils and above. It is a longer story than the others about the wartime faith of Dagan and those close to her in the ghetto and in the camp. The book contains many details, descriptions of the realities of life during the first and second stages of the Holocaust: ghetto crowding, queues for toilets, ration cards, separation of families, deportation to the camp, cattle cars for transporting people, prisoners crowded on banks, having their hair cut, being deprived of private belongings, camp clothing, etc. It would seem that this is an advantage of the book, but Aleksandra Sikora quoted earlier has a different opinion on the If Stars Could Only Speak quote. It is hard to believe that a child would understand anything of this, especially since the way the content is presented seems to be extremely unattractive, and the author gave up any commentary. One can assume that the dryness of the narration was only meant to increase the impression, but in the absence of life experience and reading experience of the recipient, his understanding and empathy can hardly be expected, end of quote. Further, the researcher emphasizing the mimetic character of Dagan's stories to both Chica and If the Stars Could Only Speak states, quote, the stories of Dagan are badly told. They lack balance between infantile presentation and cruelty of the detail. And there is no idea to encourage a child to learn about the past, because neither the paper characters nor the pathos-laden language nor the energyless illustrations will be enough of a lure, end of quote. The reviews I have cited before are the most important discussions of Dagan's book. This is not a very extensive reception, especially when compared to the reception of such popular books on the Polish publishing market as Pamiętnik Blumki, so Blumka's Diary by Iwona Chmielewska, Wszystkie lajki Marczuka by Paweł Barensewicz, or The Arc of Time by Marcin Strzygielski. It is worth mentioning that among the translated books, Dym by Anton Fortes and Otto by Tommy Ungerer have been mentioned and discussed the most. As far as the reception of Dagan's books is concerned, it must be said that this is the one of the few books in Poland whose author is a Holocaust survivor, a direct witness and participant. There is no post-memory perspective of subsequent generations, no mediation, and no story of the Holocaust written from the perspective of a non-Jewish witness. Some researchers, such as Monika Wójcik-Dudek, point out that, quote, the Polish fourth literature does not boast an author comparable to Israeli author Batsheva Dagan, and that Dagan, quote, has earned a special right to mold the young generation's post-memory, end of quote. The researcher states that although the books by the author of Chica perceived as testimonies, quote, bound up with a particular place of memory and thus never widely popular with readers, they have certainly influenced the modes of Holocaust narrative in the writings of Polish authors, end of quote. This is the last part. Piotr Krupiński pointed to the educational value of publications signed by Dagan, explaining the silences and redactions by the age of the audience. Other scholars have been critical of these procedures, writing of infantilization and pathos as barriers of reception. Certainly, the books analyzed here are separate on the Polish publishing market. I do not think that their lack of popularity is due to the fact that they cling to the memorial of Auschwitz-Birkenau. I think, however, and I agree in part with the critical comments, that the shortcomings of Dagan's work should be seen as a feature rather than a flaw. They should be seen as testimony to the work of memory, with a status different from that of other books for children. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sylwia. And now we're going to the second presentation for this session. Marina Balina.
Okay.
Marina Balina is Isaac Fund Professor and Professor of Russian Studies Emerita at Illinois Wesleyan University. The focus of her scholarship is on historical and theoretical aspects of 20th century Russian children's literature, contemporary Russian life writing like autobiography, memoir, and travelogue. She is editor or co-editor of 11 volumes. The most recent collection edited by her with Sergei Ushakin, entitled The Pedagogy of Images Depicting Communism for Children. It was published this year in the University of Toronto Press. Marina?
Yeah, thank you very much. I know you are all exhausted. I will be brief. So,
we're okay.
You're okay? Okay, good. So I take you by your word. So do you see my shared document? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, my presentation today will be pretty brief. You have all heard me say several times that there are no texts about the Shoah written by Russian writers in Russian children's literature today. However, among the translated texts, there are many translations from English, French, and German, and translations from Polish authors and authors from the Netherlands. In the context of our discussion, the major event in the Russian Translation Guild was the Master Award, Master Award 2021, which is given for the best translation of the year. In the nomination Children's Literature, this prize was awarded in 2021 to Lena Baibika for her translation of Uri Orlov's story, The Island on Bird Street, from Hebrew into Russian. This is Uri Orlov's second work translated into Russian. In 2013, his story Run Boy Run was published in Russian by the publishing house Text. The translation was completed by the late Raphael Noodleman and Anna Foreman, known in Russia for their translations of Meir Shalev. The translations by Lena Baibekov of Orlov's The Island of the Bird Street was published by the elite children's literature publishing house Samokat, Scooter, in 2020, and the illustrations, were completed by the Russian artist Anya Leonova and are done in black and white. This is almost no color. About the translator, Lena Baibekov came to Israel as a schoolgirl. When I asked her why she decided to translate Orlov's book into Russian, she said it was the first book she had read in Hebrew. Baibekov repeatedly interviewed Uri Orlov, so the work on the translation was also due to personal connection that the young translator had with the writer. Baibekov herself says the following about the importance of this text in her life. When she came to Israel in 1992, she knew little about the Shoah, only the numbers of Shoah victims, which were accessible in Russia, but without much explanation. Orlov's book was an introduction to the personal human aspect of the Shoah. It was, in a way, an exit beyond the facts of history into human life. The book was memorable, and Lena translated it for Samokat Publishing House. The fact is that the book has already been published in Russia by the Aliyah Library Publishers in 1990. Thank you, Roman Katsman, for providing me with the information and with the translation. It was published in the young adult section. The translation came out with 2 prefaces in Russian and Russian translations of the English preface, suggesting that the translation could have been made from the English edition. Baibekov's translation is more exciting and lively, good Russian without much of a slang fad. I'll come back to this text in my comments a bit later. The publishing house Knizhniki, people of the book, was founded in 2006. Jewish authors and Jewish themes are the main focus of the publishers, which produce translations of the book from both Yiddish and Hebrew. The publishing house's editor-in-chief, Baruch Gorin, defines the purpose of his publishing house as educational. Thus, he states, quote, an entire post-war generation was, as Osip Mandelstam defines it, quote, thrown out of history like billiard balls out of their pockets. I want to add that this is where the throwing out of Jewish history took place. As Gordon argues, the generation born in the 1920s and 1930s still had grandparents raised in the Jewish tradition. The current generation has no such grandparents, and their connection to tradition and Jewish history should be accomplished through a book about Jewish culture and experience. As Olga Patrusheva, editor of the publishing children's series in Knizhniki, told me, the Knizhniki children's series focuses on literature about Jewishness. Quote, if we tell children about Einstein, it is not a physics book. It is a book about his Jewish experiences and his relationship to tradition, end quote. Holocaust literature for children is vital in the Knizhnik series. So they have successfully translated and published Tamar Meyer, Francesco Sterelli's Ice Cream Store, and here is Argaman, Bear, and Fred, both in 2020. Unlike Orlov's books, Orlov's books, Knizhniki preserved the original illustrations of the Hebrew editions. Since analyzing perceptions of Shoah literature remains an important topic for me, I had the opportunity to interview both Luba Aleynik, a librarian at the, at the Leningrad Regional Library. I have to warn you, so the city was given its former name, St. Petersburg, but the district around the city is still called Leningrad district. So we have the discrepancy, yeah, which is somewhat, according to my experience, schizophrenic. So although it is my hometown. So I had the opportunity to interview two people who I found extremely crucial for the project. One of them is Luba, a librarian at the Leningrad Regional Library. So this is not a privileged library. This is the regular library of the region, where children not from the privileged school systems that are very popular right now in the city of St. Petersburg, but there are like ordinary children, ordinary schools, no special schools. So, I mean, I really aimed for my experience as an interviewer with this group of people. Yeah, the second person I have interviewed outside of Baibekova and people from the Knyzhniki Publishing House was Dr. Ekaterina Asonova, head of the Global Educational Laboratory at the Moscow State Pedagogical University. With the help of Luba, I was able to collect impressions on Orlev's book by the group of school readers at the Leningrad Regional Library, age 12 through 15. Here are some of the questions that I was trying to discuss with experts in children's literature. I'm presenting their answers with their permission and that of the children who participated in the discussion on the Orlev's book. Dr. Ekaterina Asonova, as I said, she is the director of the, of the library, she's director of the lab of multicultural education. And here was my question. Today, Russian children's literature has no authors of its own. All literature about the Shoah Holocaust is translated. Elite publishers like Samokat and Knyzhniki produce limited numbers of books. What is going on? A limited number of books, which means, as I see it, there is no complete access to this literature. Do we need it at all? How do today's school children perceive translating literature, especially books by Israeli authors? So, and here is her answer. Such literature is essential because it is meant to help normalize talk about any genocide. The appearance of this literature is a fact of acceptance by the mass consciousness of the points of persecution based on nationality. That is, in my opinion, the only possible evaluation of crimes of this kind. Now, this is important. A story about the Holocaust inevitably requires talking about Chechens, Tartars, and Kalmyks, and this is the most challenging part, about the mass extermination of people in the camps. I know that the presence of Israeli translated Shoah literature in our children's reading is significant. I wouldn't call it massive, but it is certainly essential. It is the memory of generations that have not had the opportunity to speak out. It is usual and customary for Russia to read the translated stuff and consider it our own. And Maus, and I have to tell, this is Masha Relnikaite, the only loosely considered Russian author who had recollections of that, and Beer and Fred give adults the strengths and words to talk to children. So you see the Israeli translations are put into the larger context of history. My next question was that related to the trauma writing. So now children's books about the Stalinist repressions have begun to appear. Maybe this is an attempt to start this conversation about the traumatic experience, and our own Stalin's terror is closer and more evident, while the Holocaust is a Jewish topic that is still closed for discussion. Plus, the geography has changed. All these ghettos and places of mass extermination of the Jews are outside of the present-day Russia. Her answer. The latter, the geographical location of the ghettos and Babi Yar, which is Ukraine, outside of Russia, sidesteps the topic of the Holocaust specifically. Stalin's Nose, this is the story about Stalin's repressions and Children of the Crow, this is another author, are much more relevant to our families now. And here she gives a personal example. My dad, it seems to me, still believes that Solzhenitsyn invented the Gulag. And it is strange to write about the Jews being deported to places where all those who were not saved by the Soviet camps were deported to concentration camps. My husband, who is very well-known professor of Russian literature, my husband likes to cite the village's story where the kulaks, the children of rich, kulaks children, so the children of rich peasants, were killed in the cold, but the Jewish children were hidden and rescued. Most interesting is the conclusion that he comes with. It seems that it is impossible to work with collective trauma in Russia today on the level of condemnation of state decisions. And this trauma requires the most challenging work, not only with the victims and their heirs, but also with the heirs of the executioners. For Israel, the subject of the Holocaust comes naturally. It is a pain for an entire nation. Hence, the popularity of these books, which in Russia, however, are from the realm of the foreign. My second interview was, like I said, with the librarian, regional librarian, Luba. She's young, she is 32, and she is the one who works with children groups. I mean, she has this opportunity to talk to children and discuss with them their immediate impressions after they were introduced to the text. There are, her answer to my first question was the following. There are no contemporary Russian authors who write about the Holocaust. Such major publishing houses as ACT and Exmo are very fond of this topic. ACT even has an entire series, Witnesses to the Holocaust, Executioners and Victims. These books also fall into the field of reading teens, so they translate the books for adults. For example, the most popular with teens is John Boyne's The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. We talked about this book, and the book Sieve by Marcus Sutak. So Samakat, White Raven, Pink Giraffe, and Compass Gate are elitist publishers, which means that they publish beautiful books with wonderful illustrations, but those books are not accessible. They are not distributed in the to the libraries, and those books are also extremely expensive, which immediately limits the readership of those books. But most important thing is that they are not distributed to the public, to the libraries, to the children's libraries. Although Luba states that many have sprawled to, so access to their books is quite broad. On the other hand, the Knizhniki, people of the book press, specializes exclusively on the Jewish writers, and they are less well known. There are very few of their books in our library collection, and even fewer in regional libraries, I'm sure. My second question, and the answer to the second question was quite different. Books about the Holocaust are read by those who either like historical prose or those who, for whom the work of the soul is essential. This is a quote from the 15-year-old girl. A couple of times, there was something about the collective memory. Children mentioned their nationality. And then there are the comic books and the fans who initially choose to read those comic books about the Holocaust for the sake of the genre. Finally, the example of a teenager who discovered a graphic novel of the diary of Anne Frank, got hooked, and then turned to the real text. Our library has a project, Children of the Leningrad region like it, where children choose 10 books of the year and send their reviewers. And Luba suggested that I do it with the group of children that she gathered for me. And I have done it, and here are their answers. So I was able to do it only for Uri Orlev, The Island on the Bird Street. So since two other books were not available at that library. So Children that were selected for this particular questionnaire, it was not questionnaire, I just asked them to write a paragraph about their experience with the book. So they were the age 12 to age 16. So, and here is the first one. I think that The Island on Bird Street of Uri Orlov is a wonderful read. The narrative is told on behalf of the 11-year-old Jewish boy who lost his home, his father, his friends in one day. He's left, his abandoned, bombed out house from whose window you could see through the binoculars another life. Children were living outside of the ghetto, and they continue to live more or less everyday life. The book, in my opinion, I cannot see it. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah, the book, in my opinion, is authentic, and Alex's yearning for life, his hope to wait and see his father, of great importance. Another one, I was surprised by the book because the boy in the ghetto believes in miracle, that miracle would happen, believing that the war would pass and the life will start peacefully again. No one would kill them. At one point, I even cried since I felt sorry for the boy when they were taking his father away. And another statement, the book is about my nationality, and I just loved it. So here is the quote from the 15-year-old, a very touching story. There are no physical or moral violence seen, but there is hunger and constant fear of being transported to the camps. All of this is woven into a big chain of events, experiences, and thoughts of the young author. In my opinion, this book is about what can happen when people lose the human within themselves. It is a very dynamic and sad book. Every page feels like it is, quote, screaming with pain and worry. I don't know where she took this quote from. Yet the work constantly keeps you in suspense. Each chapter you read is the last suicide for the boy. And after reading another story, you breathe a sign of relief. Perhaps this is one of the most thought-provoking books. Beautiful book. The main character didn't have the worst fate compared to some children, some kids. I like this book. It is emotional. In my opinion, everyone should read it to have an idea of what the children went through, many of whom didn't return. And the last one. The book touches the heart of anyone who dares to go on an exciting journey. After a little boy with such a brutal fate, who was caught unaware by the war. The war has left an indelible mark on the lives of thousands of people, just as peaceful and innocent as the main character who did not want war. It is a war in which it is unclear where is the truth and where are the lies, where are the insiders and outsiders. We do not choose what time to be born, but it is up to us to decide whether we remain human, no matter how hard the time may be. What I came up with, or out of this questionnaire and the conversations with the publishers and translators. What did I learn from these remarks in interviews? Number one, Holocaust topic is of a great importance to the growing generation of Russian readers, not only because of its own value, but it is raising issues not related to the fate of Jews. Number two, Holocaust topic is not of great importance for the growing generation because with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, many important sites of atrocities are not now outside of the present geography. So no connection can be made. Conclusion, it is not our history. Number three, Israeli translations are of great importance for the growing generation because they bring a natural element into the current discussion. Holocaust is, after all, part of Jewish history. The presence of these narratives translations keep the Holocaust history alive as part of the national World War II discourse. I promised I will be brief.
Marina, thank you so much.
It was an amazing experience, you know, just talking to children and talking. Well, I sort of could suspect about the editors and translators, but I never could suspect anything that I would get from children themselves. So, and they allowed me to publish their names. So I said that it will be included into my presentation, and that worked.
This is amazing. Thank you. And we'll start with questions. So please raise your hands and we'll start from Erga, please.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Sylwia. It was very interesting. Both of you asked me if it will be interesting, and I told you, yes, of course. I want to refer to Sylwia's question about the acceptance of Batsheva Dagan in Israel. Batsheva Dagan was the first author, who is not Uri Orlev, that wrote picture books about the Holocaust for little children. Since she was educational psychiatrist, and she saw the lack of good books, she was the first to be adopted by the Ministry of Education. At first, her book was published privately at the end of the 80s. I believe it was the 1989. Then it was republished and considered the first publication of the book by Moreshet Bet Anilevich, which is like Yad Vashem, Museum of Holocaust in the northern of Israel. It was in 1991 or 1992 that it was published in Moreshet. After a decade, the Israeli Ministry of Education bought all the rights of the book and included it in kindergartens as a mandatory text for Holocaust Day, Memorial Day. So because she is a survivor, because she is Polish, from Polish origin, and because it is free of charge, I believe the Auschwitz Museum bought the rights of the publication. I checked it earlier because it also interested me. Before you asked me, I wrote something about Batsheva Dagan, and I wanted to know why there are different illustrations, not of one of the most celebrated Israeli illustrator, Avner Katz. And you can see that all the text is yellow. I talked earlier about the yellowish color, and this text was printed on yellow pages, not the telephone yellow pages, actually yellow pages, and but that is the educational edition, not the original edition. The original edition was printed on regular pages, on white pages.
In the second edition of this book in Poland, the illustrations are different, but they are also yellow.
Yeah, I know. But you ask why Uri Orlev and Batsheva Dagan? I think because of the three factors. They are Polish. They speak and write Polish. They can be involved in the translation and can correct it. There is slight difference between the text, as far as I know, because I don't speak or read Polish. Second, they are the most readable writers about the Holocaust in Israel, not because they are so good, but not because of that, because the Israeli Ministry of Education puts the books on the mandatory reading list, and as part of that is giving them by free. Batsheva Dagan is totally free, and Uri Orlev is the price of the books is reduced almost as free books. So that is another factor, I believe, to translate into Polish Batsheva Dagan's books will not cost anything because those books are free. And the third thing is I believe they are easier, that they are talk about the Holocaust clearly than the later, the contemporary books. The contemporary books are very American in the style, and those are most European. And I think this is the difference. If I look what is translated into Polish, French, German, and what is translated to English only, I guess this is the difference. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's go ahead, Barbara.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I was thinking about what Erga said, and I think it's very interesting to investigate this reception, but rather of Batsheva Dagan, but rather in the context of cultural transfer, because what you said now, it's not so much an factor of the Polish reception, but a factor of bigger political issue, which is connected to how the one culture is transmitted to another culture, and what are the factors what dominates this process. And it would be worth looking at the prices these books earned, and also the author's right, and as you mentioned, this mediation of the authors themselves, because they speak Polish and they could be involved in the whole process. But not only, but because I was thinking when Sylwia, when you talked about this reception, Polish reception, I was thinking about now this is so, there is so much, there are so much critical voices of the Polish Polish critics and literature researchers, and still these are the most translated books from Israeli literature. What's the point of it? This is really amazing, and it would be worth graving deeper in not only in the Polish reactions, but also in the, I think, in the reasons why just these books and this author. What do you think?
Barbara, what do you think about, I have an idea that I was inspired by Erga, because those researchers I was quoting, they are younger ones. And they know the newest books for children about the Holocaust. So I think this is the difference of the generations. And because the difference between the Batsheva Dagan's books and the other books on the Polish market is huge, I think. The language is different. Reality is presented in differently. So I think this is the problem of this modern reading that Erga was talking about.
But not only, I think I was investigating the reception of Dutch children's literature in Poland, and now the contemporary books are translated, but at the end of the 20th century, they tried to. There were hardly ever books translated from Dutch or Flemish children's literature. So they tried to overcome this gap, and they translated books which are not from that time anymore, and maybe it's the same case. I don't know, because these books. Your question was right. Was Batsheva Dagan a kind of I don't know, a very prominent author in the? No, then I don't know. I really don't know. But this is really interesting. Who and which power stays after this translation, and so many of one author, which is not prominent.
Because you know, when I find out that that we have 3 books of Batsheva Dagan translated into Polish, I thought, oh, that's great. It's a great material. And then I started to read those books, and then I started to recognize the reception, and I was shocked, really, because my expectations was different.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote only 3 books.
Mm-hmm.
And I had also a question to Marina. What do you, because your case is shading a totally different light on now the reasons why Holocaust literature is not translated in Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And this was very interesting for me. Okay, we have our own history, which is not investigated enough, and we don't need Holocaust because we have our own genocide. Is this the logic? Did I?
Pretty much so. Yeah, pretty much so. Because remember, I mean, last meeting that we had, I mean, trust me, they got me by surprise as well, you know. And my choice of Ekaterina Asonova from Moscow, from the Moscow State University, was pedagogical university, sorry, was deliberate. I wanted to talk to her because she is the one at the core of multicultural education. So, and big proponent of this. But my choice of Luba as a librarian was totally, I mean, I wouldn't say random. I wanted an active librarian who works with children, who knows what children read. And she is, in her early 30s, she is very aggressive toward parents, which was very interesting to me. Because, you know, I mean, we talked about it before, because parents are the ones who buy the books. So if we're talking about national reading list or Putin's 100 books that he put together for the children now, well, a couple of years ago, I mean, we forgot about another very important body, able body, who has money in their pockets. So we forget about children, we forget about parents. But Luba, for example, she doesn't let parents in. So she discusses the books with children that she finds and children find important and interesting. Yes, Israeli literature about Holocaust is natural. Because you Jews, you deal with your history, and this is part of your dealings. For us, Holocaust is just small part of World War II history. So, but we need to keep you alive, and we need to translate your books, because this way we keep the memory of World War II, we create an alternative memory of World War II. Because, yeah, because the Great Patriotic War, this is how World War II is presented in Russia, is, if I don't forget remind me. So I got a very interesting question from one boy. World War II is looked at as the Great Patriotic War. So the slogan, "Спасибо деду за победу," thank you, grandfather, for your victory. This is what dominates the narrative now. If your Holocaust story, Jewish Holocaust story, Israeli Holocaust story, because this is more important than any other country, because for you, this piece of history is your history.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's go back to our natural history. Sarah?
Thank you. And those are two very interesting papers. I think the same sort of question to extend Barbara's was this tension between national pedagogies, but the national histories that are privileged and those that are prioritized, especially within educational settings, because so often the kids that are reading books about conflict and genocide happen to be doing so, at least initially, because they're assigned in schools. And so in the US, we're currently having huge debates about teaching our own patriotic genocides of, indigenous people, and critical race theory, and teaching slavery as a genocide with lasting legacies. And I think there's a lot of that. The conversation over people haven't really bowed up about teaching the Holocaust because it's seen as this thing over there where Americans went and liberated and, we're the good guys. But there's a lot more attention and people bowing up, parents bowing up about us having children's literature about slavery and Native American genocide when Americans were the oppressors. They were the perpetrators of genocide. And so I think that that's interesting, this notion of what gets privileged and prioritized even within the educational setting. And I would say there was a plethora of children's literature published in the early 2000s in the US. But there has been a shift towards people publishing books more about Indigenous and slavery, Indigenous genocide and slavery here. So that's really interesting to me, that whole tension between the pedagogy and the publishing and national histories and what gets privileged. Because even here now, a lot of the laws that are being passed by individual states that are making Holocaust and genocide education mandatory have to have the Holocaust element in it, because it's a lot of Jewish national groups that are pushing for these laws to be passed. So there's something interesting there going on as well. I just wanted to add that to the conversation. I don't really have a question.
Marina, you'd like to respond?
Yeah, well, I just, before I forget, because this is, I had a very interesting conversation. This group of children school children that were available to me to talk on Zoom with them. So I had one boy asking me a question. He said, well, you live in the West for a long time. Why do we have, in Russia, why do we have the Victory Day? And we are celebrating our victory. And in Europe, the slogan is very different. The slogan is, let us do anything and everything that it will not repeat again. And I was sitting there with my mouth open and I didn't know what to say. So, in Russia is a proverb in Russian language. So, wisdom comes from the baby's mouth. So this is how I felt. Yeah, because I didn't know what to say. So, I think what is happening, Sarah, it's very important what you said right now. The turn to the national history is very important in the present day Russian culture. But this is different in history of genocide as well. And you have liberal publishing houses and you have liberal groups that are pushing this particular literature. And this is why Israeli translations are very important. because I was trying to finish it with the thought that as long as we have Israeli writers writing about Jewish history, which is their history, everything is great. As the minute you start to to analyze our history, Russian history, then you are in trouble.
Anyway, we're in trouble. All right, Michal.
Unmute. Thank you very much for two really great lectures. For Sylwia, I wanted to ask, you mentioned at some point you kind of make a difference between memorial literature or pedagogical literature and, so to say, poetic one. So I was wondering, what does it mean for children literature? We hardly speak about canon in this forum, but maybe it's time to think what makes a literature, a Holocaust literature of 21st century, a good one. What categories would we like to use in trying to evaluate this? And for Marina, I was wondering, because I come also from the German side, at least in my research. And when thinking about World War II, there is also the role of the Russian in this, conquering Berlin and all these not so nice stories. And I was wondering, because you kind of demonstrated the national narrative of the liberation, etc. So I was wondering whether there are also other voices with regard to the Russian part in this world, and whether it meets somehow the other narrative of the Jewish victimhood, or so.
Okay, yeah, Sylwia, I think the first question was to you, so.
Okay. It is a very hard question because my doctoral thesis was about a Polish canon of Holocaust books for adults. And this process of the forming of the canon was very difficult because because to the 1977, when the book To Out with God of Marek Edelman and Hanna Kral was published, there was no book on the Polish publishing market which would be a testimony of the survivor, the testimony of the Jew. There were only books of Polish people writing about the Holocaust they was looking at. So when I was trying to, this publication of the book of Hanna Kral was a very crucial moment for the Polish canon, but I can make a risk and say that we don't have really a true Holocaust canon in Poland, because in our canon there is Borowski, there is Naukowska, but they are Polish. They are no Jews, yes? We have a canon of books mainly with a perspective of non-Jewish people. And their perspective of the Holocaust is the most important. So when I think about the canon of the books for children, I think about this Batsheva Dagan's case, because I thought that the fact that she is a Holocaust survivor will be the most important also in reception of her books. But it's not true anymore. So because any of these authors who writes about her books find it important that she is a survivor. I thought only Wojciech Dudek. So I think that the conditions are different now. and the market dictate the conditions. So the popular is what we can sell, but also the government dictate the conditions, because the government decides about the school reading lists. So the popular is what it's reading, and we have two main causes of this reading. The books which we can sell, and the books we can make obligatory ones to read for children.
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting question that you ask, you know, and this is, it requires a very long answer. It is no canon on Holocaust literature because this is no Holocaust literature per se. You know, if the Black Book, the book that was composed by two great Russian writers, Sylwia Karolak and Vasily Grossman, so about the atrocities made against Jews, was published in Russia only in 2015. So, and this question, if it was a conversation about atrocities related to this way and that way to the Jewish issue, it was either kept under control and silence, or it started to appear in the literatures of the former republics. But for the children's literature, this is only translated literature at this point. Is it read at schools? Yes. Some as an extracurricular reading, but this is not none of those books is part of the school reading program. You were asking about if those narratives, I mean, the liberation, post-war liberation, so of Germany or anything of this kind started to be discussed in children's literature. Yes. And it came as a follow-up on the literature about children in Gulag. But this is such a recent issue. 2017, it was the book, it was called Sugar Kid, Сахарный ребенок in Russian, written by Olga Gromova. And it was probably the first book about children experience in the realm of Gulag camps. The next book that was published this year by the same author is about Ostarbeiter. So about Russian teenagers who became Gastarbeiter, who became like workers or were given to the farmers and to the factories. So, and it is called Valshin. So the Russian name Vaля was Valentina. Vaля was to add, it was the German diminutive suffix chen was added to that, and it became Valshin, so little Vaля, if you want. And this is the story of this girl. There are two books that are absolutely a must to read, never ever included into the reading list suggested to children. It is up to librarians like this Luba that I was talking about, who just sits on the floor and talks to his reading group that I borrowed from her. I mean, great children. So, and she doesn't let the parents in, because the parents who come into this group, that was hilarious, you know, just to watch. The parents who come into this reading group and who try to influence the reading list of their children, they're asking for the books they have read. So, and she's saying, nope, your children are not interested in these books. This is the new generation and it should be introduced to something else. So the conversation is happening, but it's happening like bit by bit. This is no general direction in multicultural education, or it is no general direction that gives green light to more controversial works, which actually was happening in the 1990s and then stopped.
All right. More questions, comments? Mm-hmm. If not, we're going to close. Daniel?
Yeah, we should.
We should close. I just wanted to say, I know you mentioned, Marina, that you spoke with Elena. Do you want to share where she works from?
Yeah, she works from Japan. Yeah, she works from Japan. She's an amazing person. I mean, I had like, well, Zoom conversations. This is one, there are a couple of instances I'm happy to be on Zoom. So this is one of them. She works in Japan. I mean, she spent years in Israel and she's still Israeli citizen. So, but she works in Kyoto University. So, I mean, she works there and she's also wonderful translator from Japanese. And actually she translates manga, she translates all different forms of children's narratives. So, but she's published by this elite publishing houses because only they can afford the publications of such high quality books, but those high quality books come in very small numbers. If anyone donates books, I have to confess, I donated books to Leningrad Regional Library. I bought the books for them. So because I thought this is at least one thing that I can do. This is my way to say thank you for all the efforts. So if those books are not distributed by the libraries, and if parents are not buying those books, this is the void. This is, well, we talked about silence, we talked about emptiness. So, I mean, as a trope, this is probably what I need to write about.
All right, but don't be despair. In our Russian seminar, we'll talk about Israeli Russian literature, and then we'll hear the Russian voice in Holocaust literature, but not today.
Great. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, guys. It was an amazing day, and thank you all. See you tomorrow and 2:15 p.m. 2:15 p.m.
We are, yes, yeah, 2:15. Yeah.
See you here tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The